Hi and welcome to Stefan Livera Podcast, a show about Bitcoin and Austrian economics. Today, for episode 242, we are exploring the idea of maintaining Bitcoin Core. So Bitcoin Core is open source. There is no CEO, there is no top-down leader, there's no guy up the front with a bullhorn, as Tom Woods would say. So I invited Jonas Schnelli on to tell us a little bit about how it works, how does contribution work, how to deal with conflict as a maintainer, what does rough consensus mean, and we explore various different points around the Bitcoin ecosystem such as Taproot, privacy, Lightning, mining, and others. This show is brought to you by Swan Bitcoin. Bitcoin has emerged as a major player on the global stage. It has been significantly de-risked over the past year, with major investors, institutions, and companies making big investments. A common way people get started is establishing their initial position with a one-time buy and then start dollar cost averaging with automatic recurring buys. Swan Bitcoin was built to do just this. With Swan, you can create a recurring purchase plan, like $100 a week or $20 a day, and you can make one-time buys as well. Swan supports bank wires for larger amounts, and ACH transfers for smaller one-time buys is rolling out. So Swan is available in all states and territories of the US, including New York. Swan is the best place to send your friends and family when they're ready to start buying Bitcoin. Send them to swanbitcoin.com/Livera, and Swan will drop $10 of free Bitcoin into their account when they become a member. Unchained Capital is building Bitcoin native financial services, and they are helping teach people how to use multi-signature. So if you are new to the world of Bitcoin and you need to secure a serious amount of Bitcoin and you're an individual or you're a business and you need a concierge onboarding service, Unchained Capital can help you out. So the success of the individual onboarding package has now led to the creation of the business concierge package. So that ranges from $3,000 for a small business, $5,000 for mid-sized businesses, and custom pricing for large ones. This includes concierge calls to walk you through configuring the hardware wallet devices. They send you the devices and they educate you on the steps in that process. It comes with hands-on support for building the vaults and also operational security guidance. This is a great option for those of you looking to buy Bitcoin through their OTC desk and change either your individual treasury or your corporate treasury to a Bitcoin standard where you hold the private keys. So go and use the code Livera when you're ordering to get a discount, and go to unchained-capital.com for more. Now, if you're thinking of how to secure your coins, think about a metal seed backup. CipherSafe.io are producing metal backup seed products like the Cipher Wheel, and they've got a new product. It's called the Bitcoin Recovery Tag. And this can help you with recovery, you or your heirs, in fact. So it's an extra stainless steel tag. It includes info like the original wallet, some of those technical details like the gap limit, derivation types, the scripts used, and each major hardware wallet type has their own specific type of recovery tag specifying the data for that type, and it also includes a link for recovery. So that way, if your heirs are recovering the coins, they have a link and some guidance on how to do that. So it really adds that value of helping you or your heirs recover in practice. Now, the Bitcoin Recovery Tag works with any seed word backup device. Obviously, the Cipher Wheel is the product by CipherSafe, but it also works with other seed backup products. So go to CipherSafe.io and use the code Livera for a discount. Jonas, welcome back to the show.
Hey, hi Stefan, thanks for having me.
Jonas, it's been a while since we spoke on the show, and I was excited to get another opportunity to chat with you and learn a little bit more, and obviously talk about this on behalf of some of the newer listeners who are coming in and they may not be so familiar with how does Bitcoin Core work. So just for listeners who are a bit newer, can you just give a bit of background? Who are you? What do you do in this space?
Yeah, sure. My name is Jonas Schnelli. I live in Switzerland. I started getting interested in Bitcoin in 2011 and followed the open source project called Bitcoin back then. Started to contribute in 2013 and went full-time kind of as my job to work on Bitcoin Core in 2015 and made over 30,000 lines of code in Bitcoin Core. And before that, I worked as a software engineer for roughly 20 years.
Excellent. And so can you spell out a little bit about the role of, a maintainer in an open source project like Bitcoin?
Yeah, so maintaining or maintainers usually do I sometimes call it like the janitor job, cleaning up, reviewing, making releases, things that needs more attention than just writing features. I think it's very important to have stable maintainers, people that not come and go. That's what is one of the skill sets you probably need. Some basic trust from the ecosystem that you're not maintaining it in the wrong direction. And what it means job-wise, it means a lot of communication. So when I get up, go to my computer, there's roughly 150 GitHub comments in 24 hours. I need to skip through those, take the ones out that are in my area or that interests me, make sure you give feedback to especially new contributors or give feedback on things that laying around for a long time so the project can move on. And of course, there's a lot of work around features and pull requests, which means releases, testing, infrastructure, stuff like that. And luckily, we're a handful of people who do the maintaining, and ideally there will be more, but it's kind of hard to get people to commit to that job. So that's why it's currently 6 people.
Yeah, it sounds very much like tough work and sometimes a bit of hidden or a thankless task in many ways. I think for listeners who might be a little bit newer, they might just be trying to learn about Bitcoin. What does it mean that Bitcoin's code is open source and that there's no top-down leader? There's no CEO of the Bitcoin code, right?
Yeah, I think that's one of the big reasons why Bitcoin has developed so stable over the last years and so natural, because there's no leadership. Satoshi disappeared roughly in 2013. Compared to other cryptocurrencies like Ethereum, Monero, and Isus, Litecoin and stuff, they have still all a leadership structure. The founder, or in Ethereum as a good example, Vitalik is still there. And this influences the direction in a non-scientific way. And I think that's a great thing we have at Bitcoin Core. There's no leadership. And open source, in my opinion, means everyone can change the code towards the direction he or she wants. And of course, there is currently a project called Bitcoin Core, which is the dominant implementation. But it's always possible for, not in terms of a hard fork of the consensus, but to fork the code and change it in a different direction. At the end, it's the users, they decide what software they want to run. But I think Core has made a good job over the last years, people putting a lot of trust into Bitcoin Core, and think it's a stable environment for development.
So, from the user's perspective, I guess, could you just outline a little bit how developers of Bitcoin Core have to respect the wishes of the users, right? It's not that you guys are the kind of top-down leaders and you guys set how things go and everyone must use your code. Why is that?
Yeah, that these ideas or debates come up here and there. I last remember during the hard fork debate, I think it was 17 or even before, when some people said, well, the core people are not doing this, the core people are not doing that. They sit in an ivory tower and decide what they want. Well, first, it's an open source project, similar to Linux. If you put resources in, you have something to say. You can steer it in that direction. And it's completely open. So everyone can open a pull request. Is it Roger Rear, is it Jihan Wu, whoever, they can open a pull request and no one will close the pull request because of emotions. That's really important. It's scientific. So if a big enemy of Bitcoin, whoever that is, starts to open a pull request, it will take him seriously if it's technically feasible what he or she wrote. And that's really important to understand. So whenever you put resources into Bitcoin Core, you can steer, similar to Linux. That's also why IBM, Red Hat, all these bigger companies into computers, they have their dedicated contributors to the Linux kernel because they want to have a stake in it and they need it for their enterprise solutions. So they have ideas in what directions they want to go. Although this doesn't mean if a raw contributor comes and tries to change, let's say, block size to 1 gigabyte, there will still be scientific discussion and people will probably neglect to it and it will very likely not be merged. So it's still consensus. You can steer it in a way, but there's no ultimate power you can enforce if you're just a single contributor.
Right. And I presume as well that as developers, there's some level of what we might call stewardship, and you're trying to, in some way, respect the intention of the users and the kind of goals of the project, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. So it doesn't mean that every developer has its own agenda and goes into it pulls in each direction. So there's an issue tracker. Novice users who doesn't have the development skills, they file issues, they ask for features. Of course, the community as a whole gets respected in the whole development process. Reasonable things get addressed. There's a lot of development or developers, they don't have a clear perspective where they want to end up. They just want to fulfill the needs of the ecosystem. I call myself in that realm. And I think there's very much listening to the users and implementing what they want or what we think they want. Of course, if there's special needs for enterprise solutions, that's up to the enterprises to put these resources into Bitcoin Core. Usually, if someone comes up, asks in an issue, well, Bitcoin Core doesn't work with 1,000 wallets, please make that happen. Then usually we say, well, yeah, if you need enterprise solutions in Bitcoin Core, it's up to you to find these resources, eventually pay for these developers to implement it and maintain it.
Right. And so maybe it's a good point here just to spell out who are some of the main, let's call it stakeholders then in Bitcoin Core. Because if we're trying to understand who controls it, well, what are the different directions it could get pulled in? So I guess let me just spell out a few. You might be thinking, okay, well, the miners are a stakeholder in Bitcoin. People who create software or hardware that interacts with Bitcoin Core, they might be a stakeholder. The end user might be a stakeholder. Bitcoin companies like exchanges and financial services and other Bitcoin companies, they have some interest or stake in what's going on with Bitcoin Core. Are there any others, or do you want to spell out some of the stakeholders in this?
Yeah, I think nailed it pretty much how it is. And I think what still surprised me, and we have we had 10 years on the road with Bitcoin, there's still only very few companies from those one we see daily doing Bitcoin business that actually contribute to Bitcoin Core. That still surprises me today. So when we look at what companies are putting resources down, I think the one that leads out is probably Chaincode Labs from New York. Alex and Suhas's company, they employ quite a few Bitcoin Core developers and also Lightning. So I think at least 10 or around 10, and they have no business. So that needs to be said. They have no traditional business where they want to get something back in terms of financial reward. So this is more of a kind of foundation-ish approach. And on the other hand, there is Blockstream that was prominent over the last few years. Nowadays, I think if I'm right, they only have one or at least two developers working on Bitcoin Core. Some on Lightning, they reduced their resources a lot over the last years. And of course, the new players like OKCoin sponsoring a few developers. Bitmain was sponsoring, but they stopped last year. And miners have a stake for sure. We know that they want their block reward. But on the development side, they haven't put much resources in. But I think they will come now and take over a lot because they really depend on a great infrastructure.
Right. And I guess when it comes to making contributions, there is a process around this. And so, listeners, if you're unfamiliar, some earlier good episodes are the one with John Attack 124, I think, and Steve Lee, Gloria Zhao, and John Newberry. Some of those are earlier episodes. You can see those in the catalog. I'll put links for those. Jonas, if you could just tell us a little bit about the contribution process and then what it takes to, have that contribution reviewed and then merged. What does that look like?
I think if you're a developer coming from traditional software development process, more in the private sector, it's like if you worked at Google or whatever, and you come and start to contribute to an open source project like Bitcoin Core, first you need to adapt your mental set to it. Because usually when you work in a business software project, things go very fast. You write a line of code or you write a change. Maybe someone looks at it, maybe not, and it will be merged in a few days, or you merge it yourself in a few days into the stable master branch. In Bitcoin Core, things are really different and for good. So if you start to contribute to Bitcoin Core, maybe you pick up an issue that someone is requesting a feature or a bug, and you start to work on it, it will take at least normal change set. It will take at least 2 to 6 months until it gets merged, because there's so many reviewing going on. There's so much testing going on, because stability is the main focus of Bitcoin Core. And this can be hard for new contributors because they wait for things to move on, and it takes like weeks until nothing goes. And the reviewing is still a bottleneck of Bitcoin Core. So it takes a lot of time. If you want to work 100% on Bitcoin Core with all your time, you need to do a lot of changes and also a lot of reviewing to kind of fill up your schedule, because it's like a lot of waiting for your own changes. But once you have written a such change, you open a pull request and then it's public. A lot of people will comment and ask for changes, and then you need to be mature enough to accept criticism and approaches others have, or even if it's a bad idea, you need to accept that things are not getting merged.
Yeah. And so then there's also this element where in open source projects, there's often that dynamic where there are more people who want to write a new contribution, aka a pull request, than compared to the amount of resources that we have in terms of reviewer time. And then potentially even more scarce is maintainer time. Could you just spell out that dynamic for us?
Yes, I think it's a phenomenon we see in most open source projects, that people are really great in writing features, new things that are great to write because there's a concrete outcome. What we actually need is people refactoring the software, making it easier to change in the future, making it more performant. Things that are not so fancy to implement, you won't get a big reward for changing the software that's not visible, but it helps for scaling it the next 10 years. These things are actually the hard part. And gladly in Bitcoin Core, we have a lot of developers willing to do that, probably because of the funding. But yeah, I mean, reviewing is still what's missing, because, there's a lot of changes and a lot of refactorings written, but no one has the skill set, or no one takes the time to actually go step by step through every line of code and verifies it. Of course, it's done over time, but it is still the bottleneck.
And for listeners who might be newer to this, what does the term refactoring mean?
Yes, that's an essential thing that gets pushed away in the private sector, traditional business software development. So when you want to have a software project succeed over time, you need always to kind of reshuffle the code, optimize the code in a way which is not visible. There's no outcome in terms of feature, but internally it gets much easier to change things in future. Like writing, instead of one single file of code, you split it into multiple files, makes it easier to read, makes it easier to change, less impact if you change one thing at the other end, things like that. It's super important for a cryptocurrency, or it's super important for Bitcoin. And this is also why people sometimes think, well, there's a lot of development going on in Bitcoin Core, like hundreds of commits, but at the end, it still looks the same. So why is that? That's actually because we're doing refactoring.
And in the process of refactoring, that is potentially an avenue for bugs to happen. And I guess depending on whether it's like, in most cases, obviously it will be unintentional bugs, but potentially that's a risk where if someone was malicious and maybe they were a bit more calculated about that, that might be an opportunity for somebody to try to slip a bug into that code. And at that point, we are essentially relying on the skill of reviewers who know the code base, and also to some extent the maintainers. Can you outline some of your thoughts on that idea?
Yeah, I think refactorings always have the risks of breaking things, introducing former bugs or new bugs. How we counterfight that is usually we have like a suite that tests everything, or as much as possible. Of course, we cannot test everything, but there's a lot of tests testing the software automatically. So whenever you change something, you run these tests. And if something is broken, I changed it in a way which changed the behavior. Of course, not everything is tested. While there's still a remaining risk, and we had issues in the past. There was a big bug, the inflation bug, that was also due to refactoring. So it is risky, but not refactoring is even more risky, because we'll end up the software that's no longer maintainable, and then the ugly bugs will happen.
Now, some listeners might be thinking, but Jonas, I just want 21 million and I don't want any changes. Can't we just have stasis of the code? Or is it actually that stasis is not an option?
Yeah, I mean, Bitcoin was built to resist changes. That's for sure. No one wants to change the 21 million cap or similar things, because we want the value of the coin and not feature fancy stuff, right? So I think to keep it stable, we need to at least make sure found issues get fixed, because otherwise people figure out how to break Bitcoin core, how to stop the peer-to-peer network from working. So at least that needs to happen. And then scaling, the chain grows over time. We also want to make it possible for everyone to verify the chain so they can still run a full node compared to other cryptocurrencies where this is no longer possible. And also, I think everyone is okay with improving things in a way which is clearly beneficial for everyone. I'd say privacy is probably in that area. Well, some will probably say privacy is evil, but I think most Bitcoin stakeholders are very much interested in increasing privacy. So that's why still stuff goes forward.
Right. And perhaps another example of that is over time, things change external to Bitcoin. So an example would be the Tor V2 addresses is being deprecated. And so I know that was also a project recently in Bitcoin Core to have compatibility with Tor V3 addresses. So perhaps that's also an example where stasis is actually not an option.
Yeah, very good example. And I think there's a lot around that. And, HTTP, some part of it, we have some APIs that needs to have at least some minimal maintaining. Absolutely.
Gotcha. And so when we're talking about who controls Bitcoin Core, who has influence, some people make a change or some people put in a pull request. Their pull request gets attention and work, and other pull requests don't get attention and work. How does that process happen? Why is it that some get work and others don't?
Yeah, of course, there is an emotional element that's not possible to hide out. Contributors that have contributed over years with stable things. A good example is Peter Boulier. If he writes a pull request, it just gets attention because he's the father of segregated witness. He's the father of Taproot. So I think if you have a good record of valuable changes, your stuff gets more attention. That's just a fact. And there's also things that no one is interested in reviewing or bringing forward. If someone comes with good example, is probably comes all over time, always in. It's a full address index. Like Electrum servers usually do, technical thing. But if there's changes that have not much interest, it just starts to lay around there and reviewing will not happen. But that doesn't mean that the one that wrote the change and is interested to get it merged cannot find people willing to review it, either on a financial basis or just find people who have the skill sets to review it and comment on it. But usually having some already existing contributor work or help bringing forward your change is super beneficial.
What about if there are trade-offs involved with a pull request and if there's some kind of conflict that comes up? How is that trade-off managed and how do you think about that when you're a maintainer?
Yeah, that happens a lot. So even if contributors that have been working on core for years have sometimes different views on the change, if it's consensus critical, there's nothing that usually we want that everyone is on board with the consensus change. If there's loud voices against the consensus change, even if it's not the majority, it will lead to problems. So on consensus changes, we should really try to have everyone on board, or at least most people. There is no voting process or anything like that. We try to form consensus on changes. If there are smaller things that doesn't affect consensus and it's not going too much into the peer-to-peer network, it might get merged regardless of one or two voices complaining about the negative sides. That depends often on the maintainer and also on the weight of the complaint. Especially like user interface changes, it's so much a matter of taste. So if you would listen to every voice, you wouldn't get anywhere.
I see. And just as part of the development process, there's this thing called the ACK process. So could you tell us a little bit about what that is?
Yes. So whenever there's a pull request and someone starts to review it, we need an outcome of that review. We have these terms ACK, that means acknowledged or accept, something like that. So there's a tested acknowledge, a tested ACK, that means you have actually tested the software and you accept it. Or there is the UT-ACK, which means untested acknowledge. That means I have not tested it, but I have reviewed the code and I accept it. Sometimes people write code review ACK. That means I have done the code review and accept it. Ideally, especially for new contributors who start reviewing code, write a bit more than just an ACK. Start to write what have you tested, what was your feeling about it, what's the consequences of that change, so people have more trust in that you have actually reviewed it thoroughly.
Yeah. So bringing it back to what we were saying earlier, essentially what you're saying there is that in certain cases, somebody could knack something, but if it's relatively minor, then it could still get merged in by a maintainer, correct?
Absolutely, yeah, that happened a few times, and I think it's also fine that take for example a visual change that is a matter of taste, and someone says even a long-term contributor says, "Nag, this looks ugly," and maybe 9 other people accept it, so then it will lead to a merge where someone said "Nag," and it also happened on consensus changes during the debate of the block size, where things got changed regardless of nags coming from other sides. It happens, yes.
Yeah. Another saying that comes from the, I guess, computer science and development community is this idea of believing in code and rough consensus. What does that mean?
Yeah, good question. I think, rough consensus probably means if I think the voting process is not something you can have in Bitcoin Core. When I started to contribute, I thought, well, there needs to be kind of a guideline, a rule when I can start to merge things, or when does it need 5x or 10x, or is there a kind of a, ratio I need to, but at the end, it's, fingertip feeling, I would say in Swiss German, you need to have it's always different. Every pool is different. Every process of merging is different. You need to have these senses, what is good or what is not good.
Yeah. And one sense I get just from following some of the discussion over the years, I'm not a developer myself, but it seems that there's a bit of a sense that if we're going to make a change, we kind of want it to be Pareto beneficial, right? It's kind of like people only win out of this and there's no one who's like losing out of this change. Would you say that is sort of roughly aligned, or how would you respond to that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there are some things where we cannot make everyone happy. A good example, well, it's very technical, but is the new addresses for the Tor format you have mentioned before, of the version 2 Tor onion addresses. There's always downsides like other implementations like BTCD in that particular issue had problems with reading those new addresses. So we needed to decide whether we complicated more or a bug that was implemented in another software. Cannot satisfy everyone, but at the end, what Bitcoin Core tries to do is make the ecosystem as a whole, try to work towards the ecosystem as a whole as good as possible.
Yeah. And while we're on that topic as well, what about this idea of backwards compatibility or forward compatibility? This idea, the notion that somebody should be able to run Bitcoin Core nodes from 1, 2, 3, 4 years ago or even more and still participate in the Bitcoin network. What's your thought on that idea?
Yeah, that's something we take very seriously. So we put a lot of resources in backward compatibility. And I mean, where we can't is when a soft fork kind of gets activated and how we call it, written down to the code. So it's no longer possible to use the older software for consensus reasons. That's probably the only place where backward compatibility won't work. I think older nodes are still on the network. We're far away from having the newest version, the newest stable version dominantly on the network. So it's like there's a lot of old software, old nodes on mainnet, and I think that's absolutely fine. We think the upgrading process is something that needs attention and needs to be taken very seriously. That's also why there is no automatic updates and things like that, because there's always risks involved, and people should really be conscious about taking those risks and upgrading.
Yeah. And when we're talking about influence in this world of Bitcoin Core, as you mentioned, if you are a long-time respected contributor, your work tends to carry a little bit more heft or weight to it. So I guess for a developer, that's how you, in some sense, gain influence. If you are a company or a development organization, what's the way that you kind of exert that influence? Is it mainly by having your paid contributors work into a specific area of the code base? What does that look like?
Yeah, I think first there's two areas. One is the protocol development specification. It's more in that area where the BIPs are, the Bitcoin improvement process, these papers. And the other side is working actually on the core code. I think companies are usually very good in writing specifications. That means writing no code. It's pure specifications, sometime a little bit of code or reference implementation. But in that area, you can achieve a lot. And if it's a good idea, if it makes sense, the implementation gets picked up by other people, or you find people doing the implementation. But if a company wants to work on the core code, on the Bitcoin core code, it's best done by either having employees in-house that start to contribute, or by funding open source development, either through a vessel, a larger funding organization, or you hire or sponsor your own developers. Question then is, how can you influence these? And I think that's a good question in general. And if you have them in-house, the problem is the culture is so different. The culture, how you develop in-house business stuff versus working on Bitcoin Core is so different. And I would even say a guy that writes, or someone writes code in-house for a company stuff, is not ideally, or you cannot share it between like 50-50. That's wishful thinking. Often it needs so different attention spans and things like that.
Yeah, I see. On the question of funding as well, do you see that like that could be a negative or a positive? Like if somebody, I guess, and theoretically we could also not know about it, right? Somebody could be totally, a pseudonymous contributor, and they may be being funded by our worst enemy, but we wouldn't necessarily know, and they could just be making, so long as the contributions are still good and being reviewed, right?
Yeah,
But
I think a good example was when I worked with Bitmain, or they started to sponsor my work in 2016, a bit before they went into the rough side of Bitcoin Cash and stuff. So over time, I started to ask the question, is that a kind of a good relation or not? On the other hand, they have not influenced myself or any of my work. And I think it's fine, as long as somebody sees it valuable and pays for it and doesn't influence it. But of course, no one knows. There could be developers being influenced by sites we don't want in Bitcoin. On the other hand, it's kind of impossible to wash these out because it's open source, right? Everyone can try to influence it in their direction.
Yeah. And on the question of funding as well, in many cases, I have seen it done as just kind of a no strings attached. A Bitcoin company or exchange or development organization just says, hey, here's the money. We want you to just work on Bitcoin Core. In other cases, it's specific and tied to a certain project or a deliverable or something that they want the developer or contributor to achieve. What's your thought on those kinds of scenarios? Is one better than the other, or is it more just like you've got to choose the right tool for the job there?
Yeah, I think it's both is okay, because let's go down the route of you have unlimited funding for whatever you want to do. I mean, for a maintainer is a good example. You don't have an outlined project except maintaining, right? So it's probably an ideal situation where you just have the funds to do whatever you think is necessary. On the other hand, other people perform better if they have a clear outline, a specific amount of time and money for achieving a goal. On the other hand, it's very hard to estimate that in Bitcoin Core, because you cannot control the reviewing, you cannot control possible changes you need to go through because of other contributors have better ideas. So it's very hard to frame it. I think what's hard is, for a company usually has a business interest. They must be financially interesting. So why would they sponsor someone working on something they cannot influence? That's a really difficult question. And I think a lot of companies struggle with that, because they cannot throw out money out of the window. They're not a charity. They need to get something in return. Some try to get in return public relations, so they be part of the ecosystem. Customer are attracted to that. Some probably write it off as infrastructure needs. Well, you need to have the basic infrastructure to make money on top of it. But I think that's probably one of the reasons why we haven't seen, or why there's still kind of a holdback of major companies to contribute, because it's so hard to do it in a way which reflects the company's desires of making money.
Yeah, and maybe they can fund some developers if they want to keep some hardcore maxis off their back,
Yeah, for sure. I mean, if you fund in the right direction, people maybe start to be more nice to you because you have a stake in that. But I think in the long run, most people understand that the core infrastructure, it's necessary to make money on top of it with whatever company. So they see it as the base layer they need to fund.
Back to the show after a message for the sponsors. Nox is a Bitcoin custodian dedicated to ensuring comprehensive insurance coverage for client assets. Much of what passes as insurance today isn't purchased for the sake of protection, but for pure marketing reasons. Knox believes insurance should exist to make fund recovery possible. No sharing coverage between customers. Knox takes a unique approach when it comes to purchasing insurance for customer assets. Coverage is set aside exclusively for every customer in a one-to-one capacity, all with a comprehensive policy covering a range of loss and theft events, including internal collusion. If you are a Bitcoin company, RIA, fund, trust, or family office, make sure to contact Knox to discuss Bitcoin custody and insurance. And finally, Lend at HODL HODL is a global Bitcoin-backed lending platform, so you can lend and borrow anonymously on your own terms. It's a peer-to-peer solution, and they're using unique multi-signature escrow for each deal. So if you have stablecoins, you can create an offer and earn interest by lending on Lend at HODL HODL. Or on the other side, if you have Bitcoin and you need some liquidity and you don't want to sell, well, you can borrow against that collateral. So you can borrow some stable coins like USDT, for example, and you can keep on hodling. So with the Lend platform, you set your own terms and you put up offers depending on how long you want to borrow or lend and the interest rates. Go and learn more at lend.hodlhodl.com. Back to the interview. Others, such as Steve Lee of Square Crypto, have commented previously around this idea that maybe an ideal scenario would be something like a 10 by 10 matrix with many different development organizations all contributing to Bitcoin in their own way, perhaps with their own different viewpoint and such, that in that way that they may challenge each other and so on. What's your view on that idea? Are you for that, against that, or kind of neutral on it?
Yeah, I think I'd also like to see that. There's just one thing that always stands out for me, that the software is still a monolithic piece of code where we have consensus code in the same repository as the UI of the Windows application, as an example. We need to distinct where I'd like to see more people working on it or more influence happening. I think the consensus module should probably be a separate thing where we can have as much as possible influences. But then, you can say there's a lot of code that's not necessary for Bitcoin to survive, like the UI. That's a very matter of taste. There we could not see just different influences on core, we could see other implementations. Because when Satoshi wrote the application, the initial application, I think from the beginning he always mentioned it's the reference implementation. And I still like the idea, although when it comes to consensus, I'm more, I think we should have one single piece where everyone works on it, similar to the kernel or something like that in the Linux world.
Right. And if I recall correctly, there were some instances where it was actually some things, kind of bugs from other systems. And I think this was Peter Willer on Chaincode podcast, and he was explaining how with the Berkeley DB kind of debacle back in 2013, that it was like a bug from some other area was effectively becoming like a Bitcoin consensus rule, because without that, you were falling out of consensus. So I guess that's one of the difficulties, right?
Yes. Yeah, consensus. It's currently, I'd say, very hard to impossible to specify it just in words. There's a lot of code and things involved in the consensus layer, even software, external software like LevelDB or former Berkeley DB. And that's why I think having multiple consensus implementations might be a higher risk than having one where we work together on a single piece of software.
So, when we're talking about influence and ability to work on different areas of the code, is it also true to say that there are different areas of the code within Bitcoin Core on which people are considered an authority or an expert in that area? Could you spell out what some of those different areas are and how that aspect of this works?
Yes, that's true. So the areas are A, consensus, I'd say, B, peer-to-peer, C, wallet, then user interface, APIs. RPC is a good API. ZeroMQ is another API. And in all these areas, there are unspoken, not written down experts, like John Newbery is nowadays more and more in peer network. Peter Woolley is certainly one that has good insights into the consensus part, and Andrew Chow
Blockstream.
chain code, Blockstream, yeah. He's very much into the wallet. He has the oversight there, but it's a fluid situation. People come and go, but there's always someone you like to have for a review in that certain area if you want to move forward, and because they are quite the experts there.
I see. It's kind of like an unwritten rule thing that if you were to make a hardware wallet kind of pull request or something like that, that it would be nice if Andrew Chow reviews that as an example.
Absolutely. It's not necessary for a merge, but at sometimes the maintainers waits and maybe even asks Andrew if he's willing to review that pull request because it looks like he has a good understanding there. That's how it happens, yeah.
So in terms of Bitcoin Core as a code base, I guess for you as a maintainer, you're sort of more in the center and you can't necessarily go as deep into each of those different areas as compared to the subject expert, right? So how does that sort of work when you have to be, you're kind of relying on some level of the review by the unwritten experts in that area, right?
Yes, I think it's also good to know that the most maintainers have a specific target area, although it's overlapping and sometimes moving. I initially started to be ready to maintain the user interface, though over the years I moved more towards API changes and wallet. So it's like every maintainer has its own area of interest, and that's also where he picks out things he'd like to get merged and move forward. Although things that lay around for a long time gets picked up by maintainers, usually working in other areas. And there's also we have a project, it's called high priority pull requests, where every contributor can put one issue or one change in that list. So these should be reviewed first, and that's kind of a rule we try to maintain, and that also helps to review things that are maybe not in your skill set, but you still have the skills to do it.
I see. And how do you, I guess, apportion your time between the different pull requests? Because I guess there'd be a lot of people demanding your time and saying, hey, this thing is reviewed. Can you please merge it? And you have to decide and you have to try to apportion your time. How do you make that decision?
Yeah, it's that's really hard sometimes because you want to help everyone at the end, but time is limited. You have your own, or in my way, from my side, I have my own changes I want to get forward as a contributor. Sometimes even the review trading happens. That's funny, but sometimes we trade the reviews. You look at my things, I look at your things, and together we bring it forward. It's also it's natural. It's I think it's a good process right now.
So, in terms of, I'm thinking here of Jameson Lopp's famous article, Who Controls Bitcoin Core? And in that article, he spells out some of the different, controls that are in place to make sure that the Bitcoin Core code is reviewed, and also that there are ways that the end user, if they choose to, can verify that the software is correctly done. So, could you spell out a little bit about your processes that are involved as part of that? As I understand, there's things like Gitian, and you're doing like a compile, and you're essentially saying, yeah, I've signed off on this. Could you spell out some of those processes for the listeners?
Yes. So I think as an initial, or as the most important part in that circle, we use Git as a source code maintaining system. That's just for keeping the source code, having a way to verify that the source code is correct. On top, we sign every merge. So every merge that goes into that Git repository is merged together with an additional hash. So because Git is using SHA-1, which is more or less broken. That's just for the code, and each merge gets also signed with the PGP key of the maintainer that merges it. So you have at the end a possibility to verify the whole source code if there is no merge inside that's not done by a maintainer. It's not going back to the initial commit we had from Sirius or from Satoshi. So it goes back, I think, to 2013 or 14. But at least you have a certain integrity check with GPG that no one has changed the code in a way which was not intended. And from that code base, how do we form binaries? Because most people are not capable to take the source code and make it into a running application. That's still a complex thing for most people, and we still want to ship binaries, double clickable applications. And this is the hard part. How can we form these double clickable applications out of a source code in a non-centralized way? That's actually a very hard problem, and it's still not solved in most App Store cases. So that's why people came up with that Gitian thing. That's actually, can look at it as a black box, where many people can use this black box to turn that source code that's verifiable into an application you can double click, and that's also verifiable. So at the end, people who are downloading Bitcoin Core, they have an option to verify that application and look how many developers have said that this application is good to run. And this is it's an important process if you want to have critical software pre-compiled.
And just for listeners who maybe they're a little bit new, they don't know what GPG verify as a command does. Why does that help them have additional confidence in the code that they are about to run if they run GPG verify?
Yeah, GPG is a way how you sign messages, sign letters, and everyone who obtains your public key can verify that it's actually signed by you. It's called also the web of trust if you include key servers. So what it helps, it's if someone sends me a message, let's say Peter Willier sends me a message, I can verify if that message is actually written by him and not by someone else by verifying with that GPG or PGP key. And the same thing can be done for a commit, for a set of changes for Bitcoin Core. Every maintainer signs it with their key, and everyone else who can obtain the public key on the internet can verify it has been done by Jonas or by Peter or whoever, and not someone else. Or there's no slippery commit slipped in between that has rough consequences.
Excellent. And I know there is other work being done in this area, people like Carl Dong and Geeks, and this idea of reproducible builds. What does that mean?
Yeah, there's depthness or there's limits to that Gitian approach, especially the compiler section. At the very beginning, you need to have at least a compiler. You need to trust, you need to download within that process of Gitian, compiler that turns source code into binaries. That's still kind of an element we need to trust within Gitian. And you can break that further down by having just a very, very minimal layer of trust, a very simple compiler that is even on the machine level verifiable, that then compiles and bootstrap the things you need to compile. So it's very complicated, but at the end, it gives a higher assurance that no one can change things we don't want. That's why the Geeks project is worked on.
Right, yeah. So for listeners, that's an interesting one. If you're interested to go down that rabbit hole, you can go search that and look up this idea of the tool chain and what tool chain are we using to verify things and create things or compile and build. I guess people might be thinking Bitcoin Core, sometimes the code can take a long time to change because things can be delayed. Why does that happen?
Yeah, sometimes some people tell me, well, it's super slow how the process happens or how things go. Other people tell me, wow, what happened in 2020 was awesome, like a lot of changes. Yeah. So it depends also on what you expect. But of course, things can be really slow if you more known to kind of traditional software projects because stability is key. Everything is in every change, the center is stability, and if stability is not given, we cannot add features, and that's why it sometimes looks slow for most people.
Yeah. And as I understand it, there's also this thing where if somebody puts in a pull request and then sometimes other things can change around them at the time that they were trying to make that change, and then they will have to now do what's called rebasing the code. What does that mean?
Yes, that's part of the negative side to work on open source, or on things that change slowly. Assume I try to change the peer-to-peer network like I done for encrypting the peer-to-peer network. First implementation I wrote 3 years ago, and it has not been merged because very complex. We need to change things, we need to specify things. But I wrote the change 3 years ago. But in the meantime, there was a lot of other changes merged. So my change is no longer applicable to the current code base because it changed. So what I need to do is whenever something changes the area my non-merge change is affecting, I need to do it again. I mean, not completely, but I at least need to change the some things. Sometimes it's just a line of code that's shuffled in the wrong way. Sometimes it's completely different, depending on what else have been implemented in the area my change is affecting. And that's sometimes because things we merge daily. Sometimes it's like 1 week of work is just taking all your contributions, rebase them. That's called rebasing. Make them applicable for the new code base. And sometimes you introduce bugs. Things are different. The concept is different. Yeah, that can be really cumbersome sometimes, but it's part of the work.
Yeah. And what about if people have just different visions for what Bitcoin should be? Maybe some people think of it as, okay, it should just be digital gold. It should be 21 million and no more. And then maybe someone else might have a different view where they think, no, I want privacy and I want confidential transactions. And they might be thinking, oh, I want confidential transactions, even if there is a risk, I think, depending on which way you go, either a risk of hidden inflation or a risk of the encryption breaking down and then, the amounts actually no longer being confidential. How do you sort of weigh up that difference in clashing visions?
Yeah, especially you mentioned now a lot of consensus things, and if there is an uncertainty in the consensus area, my take on that is it's not getting merged. So Taproot is a good example. I mean, it's not been forked into the chain, but the code is at least now in Bitcoin Core and it's running on Signet and stuff. So I think Taproot has an overall consensus agreement that it's beneficial for probably most. Well, we don't know. Maybe some voices will come up soon, but it looks like there's super great support for it. Where other things, because maybe also said because there's no really hard downsides to it, or we don't know them yet. So I think that's also why it has broad support. But some changes have always a lot of positive and negative side effects. So I think that's sometimes why some changes have a harder time to get merged, especially like if you mention confidential transactions, they have scalability issues or scalability downsides at least. So things like that, I always think it will be very hard to get the community behind it because it's beneficial for some businesses or some interests, but not beneficial for others. That's where it makes it really hard. And Taproot, as an example, looks like it's beneficial for everyone a bit.
I see. So maybe we could summarize it as kind of if there's gridlock, it's a no-go. It's just not happening. But if you can essentially get basically everyone to agree to it, then there's a good chance you can get it in if you have enough review time and work on it.
I think you can say that although segregated witness was also partially,
Controversial at the
controversial, yeah, because of the block size, and I think everyone wanted segregated witness, or a lot of people, but they tried to tie it also to block size increase and things like that. Things like that will have probably even a harder time now when there's more eyes on the things. So we'll see.
Yeah, that's a tough one. And so I guess it's ultimately, if people really, really want something, they can fork off, right? That is always an option. And crucially, users don't have to run the code that developers give them. They can go find some other developers and run some other code, but it just essentially, you have to move the shelling point, basically. If you don't move the shelling point, if people don't go to your side, you're just creating a shitcoin, basically.
Yeah, very important. I think in that sense, these people that have the intention to fork off for a change, they probably are held back now because of the bad examples that have happened in the past. Bitcoin Cash is probably the most prominent example. It doesn't look like a successful fork in terms of monetization. And I think because of these examples, people are in the future eventually trying more to pull on one, to pull everyone into the same direction rather than forking up and at the end have a bad outcome.
Yeah, so maybe we could summarize that as there's a very, very strong preference not to hard fork the Bitcoin economy, because if somebody puts out a change that breaks the consensus, now you've got a split in the chain and you cause all sorts of chaos in the exchanges, the wallets, the whole ecosystem, because people, they may not necessarily be on the chain that they want to be on, and there's all this kind of drama about it. And so I guess we can summarize that then as saying we very much prefer soft forking for an upgrade.
Absolutely. I think the last years show clearly that this is the much better way to go for everyone.
Gotcha. And so I guess bringing it to, what's happening with Taproot and potentially what comes in the future, is it the case that maybe we've got a case of 2017 or SegWit 2x PTSD, and that everyone is kind of worried that it's going to go down like what happened in 2017, but potentially the people who are really going to kick up a stink about this have already had their chance to say their piece, and that now, fingers crossed, obviously, it looks like most people in the Bitcoin ecosystem today are in favor of Taproot. I mean, it looks like I think it's over 90% of the hash rate, effectively, the pools that represent over 90% of the hash rate, to be a bit more precise, they have come out saying we support Taproot. Basically, every well-known developer supports it. What's your view on where it is currently and the process going forward for that?
Yeah, I think there's many or some variables to that calculation. It looks like, as said before, Taproot has overall, it's more beneficial for all sides or all stakeholders than segregated witness, where people, well, even there it was probably beneficial for everyone, but people didn't see it back then. That's one side of that one variable in that calculation, and B, people learned. Good example is the miners. Miners initially thought they have their voting, which is not a voting on soft forks. They thought they have more power back then, and trying to maximize their power or maximize their finance opportunities by using that power. But they had to learn it's actually not power they have. It's just it was a mechanism to not to not lose mining power in the network rather than a voting. So they came back to the conclusion very likely that they have just to stick with the majority and make money by the block reward and by the fees. Full stop. Rest they should probably hands away. Well, if it's not beneficial to them, they certainly will come together and do something. But things like Taproot, I would be wondering if they would be against it. And of course we have shown these failed forks of these failed hard forks, and this will also hold people off of doing it again. That's not a wide or that's not a free card for every soft fork. I think especially if it's controversial, it will have a hard time. But things that really move forward and are beneficial for everyone, I think it's right now it's a good time to do it.
So in terms of Taproot, again, so there's, Bitcoin has no CEO or leader, so it's not like an authoritative answer. But I guess from your perspective, what does it look like in terms of Taproot and the process for proceeding with Taproot in terms of, when it's going into Bitcoin Core and that kind of aspect of it?
Yeah, so I mean, the specification or the discussion around Taproot are pretty old. Probably started with a mast from Jonathan Lau back in 17 or even 16 was it. So it's a long history of development. And at the end, someone wrote a pull request to implement it in Bitcoin Core. Most contributors were in favor of getting that into the main code branch. There were a lot of testing, and at some point, I think even after one year, it got merged. So it's now merged, and it will be released in version 0.21, which releases in the next weeks. But that's only the code. That's really important to know. That's the code, the potential to Taproot by these specifications. There is no soft fork implemented right now. And usually how it is, someone writes an activation for that soft fork, proposes, well, we could do it like this. Miners need to agree on this and that. It could also be a different mechanism, like user-activated soft fork. That's still open, and probably it will be a traditional soft fork where miners kind of signal their readiness. And if someone implements that, it will go into the master branch of the review, and people will run it when there is a new version. And that's how things change. And it's not some top-down structure where someone says we're going to do that soft work. It's like, everyone does its part of it. Like you mentioned before, the 90% readiness from the miners for TAP. How do you measure that? There's just one guy who set up a project. They collaborated with others to set up a project, ask miners if they're ready for Taproot and willing to do it. Everyone does its part, and that's truly open source in my opinion.
Yeah, that's the crazy thing for somebody who's a little bit new to this space, that they might be used to having a guy up the front with a bullhorn saying, "Okay, everybody, this is what's happening now." But there is no guy up the front with a bullhorn. It's actually just everyone has to self-organize in some way. So that means if you are an end user and you're running your Bitcoin node, you might want to upgrade to the newest version of Bitcoin Core, and we don't know yet exactly whether, so you might just upgrade to version 0.21, but that won't necessarily have the like activation aspect of it, but you'll have the code for it, and then the miners have to get ready for it, and everyone else has to basically make sure all their wallets and things are ready for it as well. So I guess it's kind of like everyone has to do their part.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's also really important to know that there is, or it's impossible to have a clear, how you call that, milestone plan, what we're going to do next in Bitcoin Core, because that requires centralized planning. If you want to have a centralized roadmap of things, you need centralized planning. And of course, you could try to do something in that area, but usually everyone has its own agenda and its own milestones and own path, what he wants to do, and that changes over time. And having a centralized planning, we do X in time Y, that would mean it's centralized planned, and we don't want that for sure.
Yeah. Okay. So turning to some other areas of Bitcoin, obviously there's so many different areas, but curious to get your thoughts on some of these areas around, for example, Bitcoin privacy. Do you see any things coming down the line that might assist people who are interested in using Bitcoin more privately?
Yeah, I think the missing privacy in the base layer is still a big issue. I think still one of the biggest problems we have to solve, and gladly stuff like Taproot works in towards that direction. Of course, it's not enough. There's other non-consensus changes that helps improve privacy, like the Wasabi coin shuffling approach, which is great, but I think can also be dangerous because the anonymity set is probably still pretty low. What I like to work towards is full privacy for the whole for all transactions in the base layer, in the consensus area. That's where things really get interesting to me. And well, it will take a lot of time for sure. It's not something that will be solved in the next 2 years, but I'm pretty convinced it gets solved in the next 10 years, or improved.
So what sort of approaches do you think would make the most sense there for privacy over the next 10 years?
Yeah, that's hard. I haven't evaluated all the new proposals, but what I know is there's a lot of research going on in that area with cryptographers working on it. I think right now all the proposals that have concrete steps like wallet proofs, confidential transactions, they will go through another round of specification overhaul improvement. And I think right now we don't have ready to implement technology or ready to state technology that would solve it in the way how we would all like to. So it's probably another year or two for specification overhauling.
Yeah, right. So I guess it's like confidential transactions, essentially. It doesn't have the right trade-offs that we want. And maybe in the coming years, there'll be another breakthrough in terms of how to do it with less bad trade-offs. And now maybe people would be more comfortable to have that. I guess the other big one that could potentially really move the needle there is, again, this is a future potential. It's not something anyone is kind of working on directly right now, as I understand, is this whole cross-input signature aggregation idea, which
Mhm.
maybe that's an idea that might make coin joins like make the incentive for coin joining a little bit better. So maybe that's another angle.
Absolutely. And also what we have seen over the last years is just how with pure scientific papers, how things got improved much more over the last year. So I think it's in a great state now that science in scientific papers we can get to a state much quicker than trying to implement stuff or trying to work on the detailed specifications of it rather than just coming up with new ideas, sparing each others with better ideas. I think we're currently in that state, in my opinion.
And from a Lightning Network perspective, do you play around with Lightning yourself? Do you have any thoughts on Lightning development or what you would like to see on that front?
Yeah, so I'm still very interested in having a payment system rather than just a pure store of value, store of wealth. I think Lightning goes into the right direction. It's still very early, in my opinion. It's not mature enough to be used for the broad masses. On the other hand, we have still that high volatility. But I really like the argument that there is a capable payment system called Lightning that can be pulled out as soon as volatility goes down or transactions on a daily basis gets more and more important. But right now, I think the need for doing daily transactions is not absolutely there, but it will be, in my opinion.
Yeah. And as a Bitcoin core maintainer, do you see any, I guess, potential conflict if there are things that, say, Lightning developers want? And do they ever come into conflict with just people who just want to use Bitcoin on chain?
Yeah, I think, Taproot is also an example that has a lot of things Lightning people wants. And I think there were changes, if I recall it correctly. Check log time verify is also a change that was highly appreciated or wanted by the Lightning people that has been merged a few years ago. I think most Bitcoiners or say Bitcoin developers are much interested into Lightning to succeed. So I think there's no clear or the people are sitting in the same boat, I'd say right now. And of course, no one would do a trade-off that affects Bitcoin Core as a store of value just in the favor of doing it as a Lightning support. I think right now all changes that affect both in a positive way are easy to do.
Yeah, and probably a good example is any Prevout, which Christian Decker and AJ Towns are putting some work into that, and potentially that might be a future soft fork that helps us get to the next level of Lightning Network, which is the L2. That's ELTOO L2. So maybe that would be another potential future soft fork. Do you have any thoughts on any Prevout?
Yeah, I mean, the thought I more have is that there's a lot of things kind of queuing for a soft fork. That is one particular example, but also another. And once we set the time for a possible soft fork, I wonder how much other things should be pulled into that soft fork, or should it be one after the other? Because soft forks usually take a lot of time and are hard to do. If there is an attempt to pull things together into a single soft fork, and we will see.
Right, because another one is I can't remember. I always forget the name, but it's Matt Carella's something like Great Consensus Cleanup Fork or
Yes,
something like that.
that one as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So then, there might be competing demands of people who want that, and then people who want any Prevout. And then I know Jeremy Rubin has the CTV, check template verify. So there might be kind of competing demands of what goes next if things can't be done concurrently, that is.
Yeah, and you don't want to overload softworks with features because it makes it harder to get in. And yeah, but you don't want to make a softwork every half year. We'll need to see what we can combine and what makes sense.
Yeah. The other way is potentially I guess maybe this is a bit magical thinking or kumbaya, but what if, let's say Taproot goes down without a hitch. Everyone, it's basically everyone is pro Taproot. The miners are for it, the users are for it, the developers are for it. And then maybe the next few can be done in quick succession, if so long as the ecosystem broadly considered, a super majority of the ecosystem is is pro those particular soft forks.
Yeah, I think that would be the ideal case, although we never should forget that there's always risks involved with every change, especially consensus changes. So we shouldn't take consensus changes lightly, even if we all agree that this is a beneficial thing. There should still be precautions around it, and we're dealing with a very high market value right now, so we don't want to, broadly speaking, fuck it up, right?
Yeah, I think the crazy thing is it's like this. We're all in this airplane and it's taken off and we're in the air and we're trying to change it while we're in the air.
Yeah,
It's
sometimes it feels like that, exactly. But on the other hand, you need to change things, otherwise the plane might lose altitude or even crash. So I think it's exactly that. We have to, but we don't want to, but we need to, something like that.
right. But the positive side is we're turning the plane into like a jet plane or a rocket ship. It's like it's upgrading.
Yeah, absolutely, and for sure we'll fly to moon.
Yeah. Also mining. I think that's another area we should chat about as well. So I guess there hasn't been a huge amount of negative pressure on that area, but I mean, people mention it every now and again. They say, "Oh, look, 60% of miners are in China," or there's talk about, "Oh, maybe the miners would start to have to sanction certain Bitcoin addresses or block certain addresses." Are there things that the Bitcoin mining ecosystem would need to make sure that Bitcoin sort of stays true to the permissionless ideals of Bitcoin?
Yeah, mining is one of these elements where decentralization is still a bit at risk, or censorship resistant. I think right now we're in a good state. There is no very major or very high in terms of hash rate pool around. Of course, a lot of pools come from China due to probably the cheap electricity and the closeness to ASIC manufacturing. I think even if there is a pool that gains a high amount of hash power, it doesn't mean it will super problematic short term. But of course, it needs to be addressed. And I think right now we're in good state. Probably the more time goes down, the broader the hash rate will be distributed. I don't see a solution how to fix that centralization problem. And I think, right now with censorship, there's no miners doing, were a few in the past, but none is doing it in a broad scale, kind of hiding certain types of transaction. And that's also why we want Taproot, because things will look more identical. Censoring stuff based on the semantics of a transaction will be harder. And I think we're on the right way. And miners have just one interest mainly, that's maximizing their profits through the block reward.
Right. And so theoretically, a miner who was trying to censor transactions is effectively giving up income. And so that's one of the incentives that protects the overall system. I guess the counter angle to that would be something like, oh, see, what if it's a government who pays for the mining because they want to try and kill Bitcoin, and so I mean, you can go down these kind of endless rabbit holes.
Yeah, but I think it's senseless, because at the end people would software around it. It would change stuff to bypass these preventions. And right now it's a market. If a miner starts to censor OP return data transactions, they just lose money. And maybe to get it confirmed faster, these services need to pay more fee. And at the end, someone will pick it up, even maybe the ones that were not mining these transactions, because it's lucrative to do. That's why I think the market will solve it out right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and also I guess it also depends on the miner being able to identify that transaction as one that needs to be blocked. If the person has already used sufficient privacy techniques, they may not be able to identify this is the one that needs to be blocked.
Absolutely. I mean, right now, Lightning transactions are still pretty much visible. So a miner could say, I'm not mining Lightning transactions because I fear that the fees go away from the main chain. With Taproot, things may look differently, because it's possible to make it look the same. And these things are actually helping also in the decentralization of the mining problem.
Yeah. And from a mining perspective, this is another angle of, oh, what if the fees don't get high enough in time? So I guess the one interesting fact for listeners, if you check out Clark Moody's dashboard, I think he says 99% of Bitcoins will have been mined by the year 2035. And so that means we've got about 15 years or so before basically the fees have to rise, or the price has to rise enough such that miners are getting enough of an incentive, because potentially at that point, if the percentage of the block subsidy is comprised, so the block reward is comprised of fees and block subsidy. So if the block subsidy comes down, then essentially fees need to go up a bit, and if not, we might see this kind of lumpy block reward structure, and that could also be difficult or troublesome if miners have to if that causes funny behavior in terms of like fee sniping and things like that. I'm wondering what your view is on that. Do you just think overall the ecosystem is just going to grow so much that doesn't matter, or do you have a different thought on that?
It's hard to predict. So we don't know what happens during the next 10 years. There's scenarios. I think one thing that should not be forgotten is that the hash rate can also go down. That's not a problem. Well, it might get to a problem when there's a lot of volatility happening on the hash rate market. But right now, I think we have way too much hash rate to secure the current network. We have so much kilowatts per hour on transaction that it's way too much in terms of the security we need. So maybe the hash rate will go down over the years. Who knows? And miners are eventually planning even with that their gear will be obsolete in the next 5 years or something like that, or even the newer gear they will purchase. It's hard to play out, but I think it's always good to know the hash rate can drop. We will need to deal with the volatility, with the difficulty, but it's not required to have a hash rate stable or going up always.
I see, yeah. And I guess the other, because again, there's so many moving pieces here. Another one people could do is not simply, but they could essentially require less, they could require more confirmations on the transactions they send. That's also another adaptation that people could do.
Yeah, possible. And I think also over time we will have more transactions happening on the blockchain, ideally with the same size, but even maybe with a slight increase in size, to have more. Taproot is a good example. Schnorr signature is a good example how to get more into the same size of data on the blockchain, so we can actually have more fees with not more size, and that will also work towards getting more subsidized or more fees for the miners.
Mm-hmm. Also, just more broadly, what are some big risk factors you see for Bitcoin?
Yeah, I haven't done a clear evaluation, but my gut always tells me the highest risk is still bugs in the implementation. That's probably due to on what side I work on. I still think there is, when people sometimes tweet and Bitcoin fixes that, Bitcoin always goes to moon, number go up, technology, it's all good. But sometimes I remind myself there's still risks involved, like in every system. I think in gold, it's probably, finding gold somewhere else. In Bitcoin, people sometimes tell me, well, it's the hardest money. Yeah, maybe it's the hardest money. I agree, but there's still risks. Implementation could be wrong. Cryptography could be overhauled or broken. There are risks on the implementation side, and I think these are usually underestimated.
Yeah, I see.
Not saying that it is a problem, but it's a risk, and we should address it always.
Right. And do you see a risk that if people leave their keys on custodians, or if people aren't running Bitcoin full nodes, or if they're not trying to make the system more decentralized, is that a risk in your view, or do you see that as not as much of a risk?
Not so much as I saw it in the last years. So custodial services are getting better. It's now, during the times of Mt. Gox, I don't want to know, but probably a lot of percentage of the wealth holders had a stake in Mt. Gox. Right now, it's more or less distributed. It's not only Gemini or whatever we want to name here. it's more broadly distributed. And I still think people should at least have a high amount of percentage of their coins hold in their pockets. And who knows what politically happen in the world in this and the next years. So it could be that people who want to hold more in their own pockets. And I think it's still the best you can do. But people should never forget, if you hold your own coins, you need to be your own security guard. And that can be really, really hard. You need to make no mistakes.
Do you see an importance in the proliferation of things like multi-signature and the accessibility of that kind of technology and software?
Yeah, multisig is a good example. I'm still waiting. I mean, Spectre is probably the best example how to do it nowadays, but it's still a new software. It's not really truly tested by the ecosystem. I think multisig is great, but the potential to screw up it's much higher than if you do a single sig transaction. So you need to be really careful. Stuff needs to be tested better than for single sig transactions. I think it's a great solution. The protocol layer is perfect. Just the implementation, the usability of it makes me believe it's not yet there.
Yeah. And in terms of things like the, let's call them the full node package softwares, the Umbrel, MyNode, Raspberry Blitz, Ronin Dojo, and what's your thoughts on those?
Yeah, I mean, I worked on a project on the Bitbox full node, Bitbox space. I tried to get that onto the market. It's just really a hard market. I think running a full node, in my opinion, it costs you 100, 200, 300, maybe $1,000, but you have your own view on the blockchain, your own trust layer that things are correct. And I don't know why the market is still not big enough that people want that, but somehow my gut tells me in the future people need or want to have their own trust layer to have their own view to the blockchain.
Yeah, maybe it's a question of functionality and ease of use, and maybe once it gets easy enough to have that, and run your own store off of that, or other things like that, or maybe an easy way to run it and then onboard your family onto that as well. So maybe the whole idea of the family node, or perhaps the community node, is an idea that maybe that could be developed over the next few years as well.
Yeah, I tell that since 2015 or 14, and nothing has changed much. And I hope, I mean, it has a bit, but running a full node is still, it's like, oh, you're running a full node, you must be that geek, right? But it should be like you plug it in. It's like a router at home. You plug it in and you have your access to the blockchain in a private and in a trustless way. But we're not there yet.
Last question. Do you have any predictions of what happens in Bitcoin over the next, say, 5 years?
Yeah, I think right now we see a growth in store of wealth, store of value. I think that will continue for probably a few years. But after these 5 years you just mentioned, I think there will be, or even before, there will be a high demand for also using it as a decentralized system to transport money in a much broader way than we see today.
Yeah, so that means probably a lot more Lightning Network use at that time. So we'll have to see.
Stuff like that, yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think that's probably going to do it for this one. So, Jonas, before we let you go, where can listeners find you and follow you online?
Sure. So my Twitter is _Jonas Schnelli _, or just search over the Jonas Schnelli. My GitHub is Jonas Schnelli. You'll find me there. You can follow me and see what I'm doing on Bitcoin Core. You're always free to contact me on Telegram. Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, thanks very much for joining me today.
Thanks, Stefan, for having me. Thanks a lot.
So I hope you enjoyed the show, and make sure you share this particular episode with any of your family and friends who are trying to learn about how Bitcoin is developed. Obviously, we're all big fans of number go up, and that's important too, but let's also make sure everyone is being skilled up and learning about how Bitcoin development works and how that ecosystem is operating. And so that way people know how to either contribute additional resources, either from development time of their own or funding of money to fund the ecosystem and help protect our investment. So make sure you pass this one on to any friends who are still trying to learn about Bitcoin and how it works. It can be challenging for people when they are new. So go and get the show notes at stefanlivera.com/242, and I will see you in the Citadels.